pasinaudosime jūsų pastabų peržiūrai, jeigu tokių būtų, kad jas galėtume panaudoti rengdami tolesnės gaires. Ir susitikimui skirta, kaip minėjau, nuo 10 iki 12 valandos. Pats pristatymas studijos vyks anglų kalba, jam skirsime laiko iki 11:30 ir atitinkamai po to turėsime laiką klausimams ir diskusijai ir atitinkamai informuosime apie tolesnius žingsnius, kuriuos numatome priimant Vandenilio plėtros gaires ir veiksmų planą. Just a few words in English. Jai, Shane, I'll be giving the floor to you, and then you'll be able to present the study, results of the study, and then afterwards there will be a questions session. So the participants could ask you in English or in Lithuanian. So we agreed with Ervinas, he would help us to moderate Q&A session, and in case there will be needed any translation or interpretation, he will be helping us. Taigi, norėčiau, kad susitikimas, kadangi yra įrašomas, norėčiau, kad susitikimo dalyviai išjungtų mikrofonus ir pristatymo metu ir juos įjungtų, kai norės užduoti klausimus. Klausimus užduoti reikėtų pakėlus ranką, kad galėtume matyti klausančių eilę. Tokiu būdu mes galėsime konstruktyviai ir sėkmingai vykdyti šį susitikimą. Taigi, daug negaištant laiko, norėčiau visus pasveikinti ir padėkoti prisijungus prie šio susitikimo ir norėčiau suteikti žodį gerbiamai energetikos viceministrai Daivai Garbaliauskaitei.
Labas rytas. Labai malonu iš tiesų, kad turime šiandien tokį gausų būrį prisijungusių. Vadinasi, tema yra labai svarbi ir aktuali. Tai gerbiami Vandenilio platformos ir kiti renginio dalyviai, siekiant užtikrinti spartų Lietuvos ūkio perėjimą prie atsinaujinančios energetikos ir žaliosios transformacijos skirtingose šalies ekonomikos sektoriuose. Energetikos ministerijos iniciatyva parengta ir šiandien pristatoma nacionalinė naujosios atsinaujinančios energijos rūšies, tai yra vandenilio technologijos plėtros Lietuvoje studija. Vandenilio technologija šiandien yra vertinamos kaip ypač svarbus ateities energetikos sistemos dalyvis, kuris gali būti sėkmingai pritaikytas transporto, pramonės ir energetikos sektoriuose. Todėl tai yra vienas iš perspektyviausių klimato kaitos problemos sprendimo būdų. Geopolitinė situacija akivaizdžiai rodo, kad vandenilio technologijos gali tapti reikšmingu energetinės nepriklausomybės faktoriumi. Ir tai jau yra ne tik Lietuvos, bet ir viso pasaulio energetikos sektoriaus ir visos ekonomikos nepriklausomybės garantas. Skatindami atsinaujinančios energetikos Lietuvoje proveržį, mes numatome, kad vandenilis ateityje turėtų spręsti perteklinės elektros energijos balansavimo bei saugojimo problemų. Taip siekiama mažinti klimato kaitos poveikį aplinkai, kaip tai yra numatyta ir patvirtinta Europos žaliojo kurso ir vandenilio strategijose. Norėčiau akcentuoti, kad mūsų 18 vyriausybės programoje pabrėžiamas žaliojo vandenilio vaidmuo ir įsipareigojimas sukurti būtent žaliojo vandenilio gamybos pagrindus. Ir šiam tikslui yra būtent ir numatomas skirtingų sektorių organizacinės, infrastruktūros plėtros ir investicinės priemonės. Kaip žinia, vandenilio technologija Lietuvoje iš esmės yra susijusi su vandenilio panaudojimo trąšų pramonėje, naftos perdirbimu, keleivių ir krovinių pervežimo sektoriais, jūriniu ir geležinkelio transportu. Formuodami užduotį studijos rengėjams mes siekiame įvertinti ne tik ekonominius vandenilio tiekimo vertės grandinės sukūrimo aspektus, bet taip pat skiriame dėmesio socialinį ir inovacijų ir mokslinių tyrimų dimensiją. Sukūrę vandenilio gamybos pajėgumus, numatome, kad būtent mūsų dujų perdavimo sistema galėtų tapti pagrindiniu žaliojo vandenilio dujų transportavimo regione ir pačioje Lietuvoje tinklu. Šiuo metu Lietuvoje kuriami vandenilio judėjimo koridoriai galėtų įgalinti konkurencingos vandenilio rinkos sukūrimą ir užtikrintų vandenilio pasiūlos ir poreikio balansą. Tas galėtų sudaryti sąlygas transportuoti apie 400 teravatvalandžių vandenilio, kas netgi faktiškai viršytų ES komisijos išsikeltus tikslus 30 metams. Taigi studijos rengėjams buvo keliamas uždavinys išanalizuoti pasaulyje ir Europoje vykstančias vandenilio plėtros tendencijas, įvertinti Lietuvos vandenilio energetikos, pramonės ir transporto sektorių stiprybės ir galimybės integruoti vandenilio technologijas, bei sumodeliuoti keletą Lietuvos energetikos sektoriui būdingų scenarijų, bei pateikti pasiūlymus dėl svarbiausių šiai technologijai vystytis reikalingų veiksmų artimuoju laikotarpiu ir perspektyvoje, žiūrint į ateitį iki 2050-ųjų. Būtina atsižvelgti, kad darni ekonomikos plėtra yra vienas svarbiausių Lietuvos prioritetų, todėl jau šiandien turime žvelgti į perspektyvą, kaip gyvensime po kelių dešimtmečių. Tam būtinas sistemingas investicijų planavimas ir nuoseklus skirtingų ūkio sričių bendras pasirengimas, strateginių reformų ir projektų įgyvendinimą. Vandenilis yra nauja technologijų kryptis, kuriai skiriame ir skirsime didelį dėmesį, siekiant dekarbonizuoti šalies pramonės, transporto, energetikos ir pastatų sektorius. Negana to, kurdami vandenilio ekonomiką siekiame ne tik dekarbonizacijos tikslų. Vandenilio technologija sukuria naujas vertės grandinės, darbo vietas, sukuria pagrindą inovacijoms, iš esmės perbraižo pasaulio ekonomikos žemėlapį ir formuoja ateities energetikos sektorių. Taigi, gerbiami, studijos pagrindų kuriamos vandenilio plėtros Lietuvoje gairės privalo išnaudoti naujai atsiveriančią ekonominę galimybę mūsų valstybei. Ne tik sumažinti priklausomybę nuo iškastinio kuro, bet ir tapti vandenilio eksporto šalimi. Taigi jūsų klausimai, pastabos ir komentarai šiandieną padės siekti kokybiško vandenilio technologijos plėtros teisinio reguliavimo ateityje. Linkiu šiandieną informatyvaus renginio ir labai tikiuosi, kad pristatomos studijos įžvalgos suteiks daug naudingos informacijos ir taip pat turėsite galimybę konstruktyviai diskusijai, kurios rezultatai tikrai atitiks jūsų ir visos Lietuvos ekonomikos dalyvių lūkesčius. Tai ačiū labai ir linkiu naudingos diskusijos.
Ačiū viceministrei, tikrai padrasinantis ir žodžiai ir aš tikiuosi, kad mes galim pereiti prie pačios studijos pristatymo. Now we shall move to the presentation of the study, of the results of the study and main outcomes of this research. So the floor will be given to the organizers and presenters of company Baringa. So Jayesh or Shane, who will be stepping in, and so the floor is yours, and we are deeply listening. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sylvanus. I will start. I think what I would suggest is that I'll start with just a very brief personal and Baringa introduction, pass on to Shane, and then my colleague Venus as well, just so that you know who you're talking to. First and foremost, it's a pleasure to be with you here today. At the latest count, we seem to have 165 people on the conference, which is fantastic. Great to see everyone. My name is Jayesh Palmer. I'm a partner in Baringa's Energy and Resources sector team. I come with the benefit of 25 plus years of experience consulting to the sector, and in particular claims to fame that are relevant for this work is that I led the work that formed the basis of the integration of the Baltic gas economies, the creation of the single entry and exit hub across 3 of the 4 countries, with Lithuania potentially joining. I've also undertaken a significant amount of work in the hydrogen sector along the value chain, but also in the development of policy, regulation and industrial policy in hydrogen, albeit accepting that that's at an early stage. I'm just going to pass on to Shane to introduce himself, then Venus, and then I'll introduce the project as well.
Thank you, Jayesh. You've got Shane Heffernan here. I'm a senior manager in Baringa's London office, and like Jayesh, I focus a lot on hydrogen within Baringa. Beyond this work, also in working for both startups, oil and gas firms, and utilities in advising strategic market entry as well as project advisory alongside this policy work. With that, I'll pass over to Ervinas.
Hello, I'm Ervinas, associate partner from Studiją Vilnius office. And well, compared to Jayesh, I only have 10 years of experience, mostly in energy. So I was pretty happy to contribute to the study.
Great, thank you very much. And just as we initiate this work and discuss this, if there are any specific pointed questions, we're happy to take those through, but in view of the numbers of attendees on this conference call, we will be sparing some time at the back end of this conference call for questions. So there will be some time for general questions, but by all means, if you've got anything specific or if you want to raise something at a particular point in time, please raise your hand or signal that you've got a question. As I said, it's been a pleasure to have worked on this. The program of work has taken place over the last 6+ months, and we're, the sort of contents of the full work have really covered 4 key elements of this in terms of the creation of a broad level policy and roadmap that is attuned to and specific to Lithuania. The first part of it has really been a policy review of a number of analog or benchmark countries. So we've looked at 10 countries with published hydrogen strategies to assess the level of ambition, target use cases. How is it that hydrogen will be applied in the energy system? What's the approach to funding? What are the approach to establishing markets, establishing regulation and incentive arrangements to promote the development of the hydrogen value chain? So we've undertaken these 10 benchmarks with a view to identifying lessons and implications for Lithuania. The second thing that we've undertaken in some detail is a SWOT analysis of Lithuania's particular situation, really in the context of the development of this hydrogen economy. And this section will provide a clear context for the use cases that can be targeted, what technologies can be used, what opportunities exist, but also on the supply side, how hydrogen supply will develop. The third element of this, we're really looking at the long-term scenarios of hydrogen with the intent to support the development of a long-term vision that is based on broad economic principles in terms of the value case associated with switching to hydrogen and the development of hydrogen economy. And then the final area is really looking at the development of a strategy and implementation in the form of, associated with the base case view of the hydrogen development and the upside and low side cases associated with the development of a roadmap and an action plan with ownership responsibilities to be provided for achieving the 2030 horizon of that vision, but also presenting a path longer term. I think it's worthwhile noting that this is a very strategic study. It's going all the way out through to 2050 with specific implications for 2030. So necessarily the level of detail is lighter, but we have gone into quite a lot of detail, both in terms of how hydrogen would be generated and how it would be best used in the context both of Lithuania, but also the context of regional developments associated with that. The final thing I would like to say is that clearly, since the start of the work in December last year, the world has changed in many respects with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But one thing that has been brought to the fore, and that is, even more critical for the development of the hydrogen economy, is the notion of energy security. And the critical thing about hydrogen is that it will support energy security, energy and sorry, someone put me on mute partway through that, but it will also support the process through to decarbonisation, as one of the key vectors through to decarbonisation is the sort of hydrogen vector, which is what we're talking about today. So that's the introduction to the study, the broad contents of it, and what we've got over the next hour and a half or so is really a sort of fairly quick walk through the sort of main components of it. I'm going to pass over to Shane now to talk through some of the first elements of detail of that.
Thank you, Jayesh. And I think we will focus first on the setting out the Lithuanian context and also the context for hydrogen and how we built those 2030 and 2050 scenarios from that context. That'll take us through the next 30 or 35 minutes. We'll then maybe pause for a couple of questions before we move on to the second half of the presentation, where we'll discuss the roadmap and action plan to achieve those scenarios. So I think the very first thing we wanted to do is put hydrogen in context. So setting out what is it that drives hydrogen demand, what is driving hydrogen demand in the next 10 years versus in the latter half of the journey to net zero, and what fuel is it displacing, and what policies are driving that. So over on the left-hand side here, we've identified, I think it's 11 use cases for hydrogen potentially in Lithuania, and not all these use cases are equal. Certainly some of them, such as using hydrogen in the fertilizer industry and in the oil refining industry, are use cases that already exist today, but use hydrogen in a way that is not carbon neutral. It's done by processing natural gas. So those form the almost easiest to target use cases, and for that reason, we expect to see hydrogen, decarbonized hydrogen, used in these use cases within the next 10 to 15 years across the EU. Alongside those, you have use cases in road transport, particularly in trucks, maybe to some small extent also in passenger cars, where those cars are heavier. And these use cases rely on using hydrogen, where the use of battery electric vehicles is the other main option to decarbonisation. And hydrogen becomes useful in this context because it has more energy density than batteries. So particularly where there are large vehicles with large payload, the use of hydrogen sort of allows that drivetrain to be powered in a way that's not cost prohibitive, unlike batteries. We're also displacing diesel in these scenarios, and for that reason, the economics of switching fuel from diesel to hydrogen is less of a barrier than it is in some of the longer term use cases where we're displacing natural gas or kerosene or fuel oil. These longer use cases, then, the ones we expect to really kick off post 2030, although we will see some pilot activity this decade, are things like shipping and aviation, and to a much lesser extent than heat. So shipping and aviation, hydrogen is one of the only realistic options to decarbonize away from the existing fossil fuels, but the cost and level of investment required dictates that these use cases will come after the lower hanging fruit of fertilizer, oil refining, buses, trucks, rail and cars. Finally, then, heat has, both for buildings and for processes, has been touted as a use case for hydrogen. Nevertheless, it's also quite likely that there are other means of decarbonisation that will result in those use cases going down a different path. So there's a lot of uncertainty there, and the use of hydrogen for heating in those cases very much depends on the individual country and sometimes even the individual region or city context. So if that's the sort of landscape of where hydrogen will be used, or the use cases that hydrogen will be used, over on the right hand side here is essentially a summary or synthesis of that benchmarking exercise that Jayesh mentioned, where we've looked at 10 other countries to spot what are the common themes and what is the level of ambition in their hydrogen strategy. So the first thing we looked at is supply, transport and storage. How are these countries producing and moving hydrogen around in the next 10 to 20 years? What we see is increasing energy security through hydrogen is an explicit statement in many of these strategies, particularly where countries recognize that there is a abundance of renewable energy to be leveraged, to be used, and there is a current reliance on gas and oil imports. Secondly, there's a question over how hydrogen is produced. Many of you will know that there's typically two primary forms of hydrogen quoted. Green hydrogen used through electrolysis from electrolyzers that uses renewable electricity and water to produce hydrogen. And blue hydrogen, which is essentially the way that hydrogen is produced today by reforming natural gas, but with the added step of capturing the carbon that comes out. And what we see is that green hydrogen is typically prioritized in these strategies, but blue hydrogen, that methane reformation with CCS, is accepted as low carbon in some cases. And these cases are, for example, in the Netherlands and in the UK, where it's accepted that there is currently a lot of natural gas infrastructure, and there is still some domestic natural gas extraction to underpin that. And then the final point about supply is that there is a question around whether to be a net importer or a net exporter of hydrogen, and we see different approaches to that. So in Germany, for instance, we see that the scale of ready demand for hydrogen in the next 10 years and the comparative lack of space to develop new renewables means that they expect very much to be net importers of hydrogen. They will produce hydrogen domestically themselves, but they will also embark on trade deals with other countries to import hydrogen. And we see a number of MOUs, memorandums of understanding with other countries to investigate that happening already. Other countries such as Spain and Portugal, we see them identifying as net exporters rather. And the logic there is that these countries are highly competitive in the cost of renewable electricity that they can produce. And for that reason, they expect to be able to challenge the local domestically produced price in other regions of Europe. Then when it comes to ambitions and targets and use cases identified, typically all of these countries use 2030 as a target horizon, as we have, to start gearing their funding efforts and their market design and regulation efforts towards. There's an emphasis on treating proven demand first, targeting those use cases that already use grey hydrogen, but also targeting multiple use cases such as the road transport use cases we talked about, and in some cases also early pilots in those longer term use cases in shipping, aviation and heat. Flexible power is another use case that we haven't touched on yet, where some countries are aiming to achieve a net zero power system very quickly. So the UK is one of these, as is Lithuania, where a 2035 net zero power target is essentially driving the need for low carbon or zero carbon flexible power within the next 15 years. Then in terms of building early confidence in hydrogen, public transport is seen as a way to provide early learnings, small scale use cases that can deliver expertise within the economy quickly. And buses are seen as a way to do that. It's not seen as an either or in terms of hydrogen versus batteries versus other fuels, but very much a case by case basis. There will be some cases where hydrogen is appropriate. There will be other cases where batteries are appropriate. And then finally, most countries are experimenting with testing hydrogen blending into the gas network. This is accepted as a reasonably limited means of decarbonising the gas network, and certainly more of an interim step rather than a long-term solution. But nevertheless, this testing is necessary to establish sort of health and safety and technical limitations of moving hydrogen around as a gas through the current natural gas pipeline infrastructure. Then the final point is mechanisms, incentives, and initiatives. So what are countries using to get moving? The one common we've seen from the top down at the EU and down into individual member states is the use of hydrogen valleys. So establishing economic zones early where multiple activities relating to the hydrogen value chain will emerge. We see some countries investing early in aviation and marine, despite these being more long-term use cases. These are typically countries probably on the western front of Europe, where large transport hubs exist in aviation and marine. And then we're seeing nurturing technologies through pilots, but also maintaining technology competition and market mechanisms. So there's always a tension between being able to back the hydrogen economy, but also being able to allow competition between technologies where it's not necessarily clear-cut, which is the best. For that reason, we see CapEx available as funding for early stage projects, but when it comes to business model design, moving beyond the initial pilot CapEx funding and into a more market-based source of subsidy, then open technology competition tends to be more favored. We also see that sourcing hydrogen outside the EU is likely. This has been reinforced since we drafted this study by the latest round of EU proposals for hydrogen. The EU now expects 50% of hydrogen up to 50% of hydrogen to be imported to meet its 2030 targets. So that import question is as big as the domestic production question. And then finally, we see supporting of domestic champions and building capabilities. So where there are strong OEM manufacturers already providing equipment to these use cases, we see them getting involved early in supporting the hydrogen economy and making sure that they are very much networked in with the national hydrogen industry interest groups. And finally, as a policy point, sometimes it's tempting to address the cost of fuel switching, but in particular for some of these transport use cases, the total cost of ownership of vehicles is key, and we see incentives not just to switch fuel, but incentives to switch vehicle as being part of a complete package to promote switching away from diesel and petroleum fuels. So I'll pause there and move on to the next slide. So on this one, Ervinas, you're going to talk us through how we've taken that view to come up with a sort of a central scenario.
Yes, absolutely. So recently we've been thinking about the future in our project steering committee and more broadly with stakeholders. And we were trying to project the low carbon hydrogen demand until 2050, which does seem to be quite far in the future. But on the other hand, I expect most of the people on this conversation to be still around that time. So it's a date that we should treat seriously. And the way we projected the demand is by taking each of the 11 use cases and thinking about where can the demand of hydrogen go. And while we do not expect each single use case to be exactly where we projected it to be at a particular point in time, we do think that at least until 2050, they should converge to some picture that will probably be roughly what is expected here. And in fact, let's say 10 years ago, we were trying to predict what will be the gas demand for Lithuania for basically the last year. And while we succeeded to do that, in some places it was not exactly, as predicted. For instance, we predicted that CHPs would use more and they used less, but on the other hand, industry, picked up a slack. So we expect here some changes might be there, but overall picture, we're pretty, let's say, at this point in time, we're pretty confident about that. And of course, there were some fundamental assumptions made, when drafting this about Lithuania and also about the European Union. So first of all, we assume that the industry landscape will be similar to what we have today, most notably that fertilizer production will still happen in Lithuania, and nitrogen, fertilizer. And the second, that let's say oil refining, or at least the production of some kind of combustible fuel, will still be happening in Lithuania rather than not. And also, we presume that people and goods will still be, traveling around the country and around the region. So that's for Lithuania. And for European Union, we assume that by 2050, European Union will achieve its stated climate and decarbonization objectives. Not necessarily the interim objectives, but in 2050, we should be, let's say, decarbonized. And second is that the local European Union industry will be effectively protected from, let's say, producers or from other countries where carbon is free, or let's say, or the carbon emissions are, let's say, lower than in European Union. So these are the main, let's say, underlying assumptions. So then we added, let's say, the SWOT analysis for Lithuania, we added the projected cost of technologies, and we cross-checked and sense-checked, the assumptions with stakeholders. And this is the picture that we came up with. So here, I would say that we should look into the first period, which we say it is until 2030, and then 2030 to 2050. So for let's say, and let's go bottom up. So first we have the fertilizers. And we believe that the centralized nature of fertilizer production, it does offer opportunity to scale early. And also there are some regulation mandates. And on top of that, already the European Union funding is available for partial decarbonization of fertilizers. So we are pretty sure that until 2030, the fertilizer producer will decarbonize at the level it is shown here. And then it will be a gradual, let's say, a step change in decarbonization of current gray hydrogen producers. So we expect that until 2050, let's say the overall level of production will stay the same, but instead of gray hydrogen, it will be some kind of low carbon hydrogen, preferably green hydrogen. So that's fertilizers. And fertilizers will be, we predict, let's say, the largest use case for hydrogen, as it is now, actually. And as it is now in the region as well, not necessarily in Lithuania. So then heavy goods vehicles will be the second largest use case. And we believe that while, let's say, light passenger vehicles or light goods vehicles will be mostly electrified, the vehicles that are really, hauling large, like heavy cargo, will be mostly running on hydrogen. And this will not happen overnight. We predict that this will not start happening really fast, probably until 2030 plus. And then it will be gradually increasing, throughout the years. So the heavy goods vehicles, while, let's say, in the next 5, 10 years, maybe even 15 years, will not be massive, it will be really important for Lithuania to switch to hydrogen in some of the cases there. So the third use case is the oil refining, or let's say refining of some kind of fuel that will eventually turn to green fuel. And we predict that to be, let's say, started happening, let's say, in the decade of 2030 to 2040, and finished with decarbonization until 2050 when it should be. And then we have quite a few of smaller use cases that are nevertheless important, to us, which is all of the transport cases that will be also gradually, let's say, moving to hydrogen, but not all of it. For instance, in rail, we believe that electrification will happen, as according to the plan, but the remaining sections that are not electrified may be converted to hydrogen. And let's say the last notable use case is the flexible power requirements. While it is not, let's say, as large of a hydrogen demand as for fertilizers, it is still nevertheless really important for the system to work, so that we would have that flexible power capacity driven by hydrogen. So that's, the overall picture until 2050. So, but what is most important, and I guess what is most important for nearly 200 people who are here on this call, is what might happen until 2030. And we believe so that until 2030, so cases that are more centralized and cases where effective government intervention is possible or changes are possible might, start happening. So we expect the, fertilizer producer to carry on with their plans of partial decarbonization, and that, to be honest, will take most of the 2030 hydrogen demand, or green or low carbon hydrogen demand. And then the rest of the cases until 2030, we recommend that to be, let's say, a pilot case. So for goods vehicles, for oil refining, for buses, and for flexible power, so that, we at least start to use hydrogen in places where eventually, or rather quite soon, it will make much sense to do so. And the earliest of those, let's say, smaller business cases or cases for green hydrogen is the buses and the city buses. And they could adopt, let's say, about 1,000 tons per year by even 2026, around that year. But of course, it is a small scale if you compare to the rest of hydrogen demand. So if we look in 2050, Lithuania will achieve the net zero, perhaps not as quick to decarbonize if we look into the next 10 years, but we expect the pace to be picking up, and this is probably consistent with what some of the other European Union countries are planning to do. And that's that, really. The final thing I wanted to add here is that while we do ride here and sometimes say that the low carbon hydrogen, this is purely because we do not want to exclude other, let's say, low carbon options, rather.
The level of ambition in the EU is clearly very high at the moment for the pace of rollout of hydrogen. And when making the strategy, we've been in the slightly awkward position where the ambition is stated but not approved. And naturally the question arises, well, how does the central scenario that we've got here align with that level of EU ambition? The answer is that it is slightly more tempered than the EU level ambition. But in our full report and in our full strategy, we have three different scenarios. We have a sort of a central scenario that Urbanus has just presented, and a more conservative scenario. And as and when that EU level of ambition becomes approved and starts to filter down into member states, then the analysis around that higher scenario becomes relevant potentially in forming the strategy, and allows this strategy to become I guess a more living strategy that can be reviewed periodically as it evolves.
Yeah, thanks, Shane.
Sorry, Urbanus, if I were to add one additional point, as I said at the beginning, I mean, I think in terms of the policy, regulation and direction fallout, from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, whilst that's still developing, one direction of travel is clear, which is that we will never, have the same level of dependence on Russian energy as we did as Europe, and that is fueling a very substantial push for energy security of supply and energy independence, with hydrogen being seen as one of the big vectors. So we've already seen early stage, policy announcements from the EU on that. We can expect to see more. And as Shane says, that whilst we have accounted for that in terms of our high development scenarios, we need to probably temper that with a little bit of the amount of time that will take to gear up and accelerate, and that's why we've still got comfort in terms of the four scenarios, the three scenarios that we've got set out: a lower base and a high scenario.
Yes, and now this slide, and there are several reasons why we're showing this slide. So first of all is to say that there are some financial details attached to all three scenarios, and here, of course, the base case is shown. And for 2022-2030 period, if we would like to proceed with the base case, and of course, this is our recommendation, so the, let's say, investment might be up to 994 million. So while it's not free, it's not like super, let's say, massive amount. And the second thing we wanted to stress here is that while we're speaking about the hydrogen and electrolyzers that are really expensive, we're really speaking about also increasing renewables, because if you think about green hydrogen, you also think about quite rapid expansion in renewables to the tune of, for each euro that you will invest in electrolyzers, you will want to invest like 2 more euros in renewables. So that means that, this also means that Lithuania, in step with hydrogen, with green hydrogen adoption, will also be increasing its renewable, let's say, capacities. And this is like mostly wind capacities here. So that's the major investment now and going forward. On top of that, there will be some requirements and some increasing requirements for after 2030 for the storage of hydrogen and also for the refueling infrastructure. So as let's say the smaller user cases, the uptake of those increases. So we have more heavy goods vehicles, we have more railway on hydrogen. The refueling infrastructure will have to be increased. And of course, you can't just have hydrogen, you also have something to consume that hydrogen. So the heavy goods vehicles, the buses, the railway will also have to be, let's say, developed for that, so that you will have appropriate vehicles for that. And until 2030, we see a number of cases of that would make sense to, let's say, try and channel the money is for the pilot cases for heavy goods vehicles and refueling stations, for rolling out of hydrogen buses in at least some of the largest cities in Lithuania. So our recommendation would be those of around 100,000 inhabitants or more. Then, of course, funding focused on collaboration with industry and research and development. Well, this is something that we should be taking, care of. And then various other things, including establishment of hydrogen valleys. So since there will be European Union financing available for the valleys, it makes full sense to go ahead and do that. And and all of this will require a combination of public and private sector investment. And that's that. So for 2030, we encourage ourselves, well, I'm from Lithuania, so I encourage myself also to think about the pilot projects and also of scaling up of renewables, scaling up of uptake of electrolyzers that churn out green hydrogen. So yeah, Shane, Jayesh, anything else?
I suppose it's probably worth mentioning that there's there are differing levels of uncertainty in cost estimates that depend on how mature each component of the value chain is. So the cost of renewables is something we are reasonably confident on. Lithuania and Europe more broadly has had a good 10 to 15 years now of renewables deployment where those costs have been well understood. The cost of electrolyzers, the production of hydrogen through electrolyzers, is set to come down quite substantially over the next 10 years. But as with renewables and then batteries, how quickly that can fall can surprise people. And then its ability to rise after having fall already can also surprise people again. And that is just the nature of of a relatively new technology with a relatively new supply chain dependent on commodity minerals.
Yeah, Shane, you're absolutely right. I think maybe even Oxford University had a study that looked into the projections for cost of renewable electricity technologies. And I think in most, if not all of the projections that were used by International Energy Agency and other reputable institutions, the costs were usually overstated. So while we use their estimations and also our estimations, it might be that going forward these technologies might be, let's say, slightly less expensive than we think they will be, but nevertheless we allowed for some reduction of the cost, but we did not allow for really say 3-4 times less cost, although this might happen, but we just can't be sure about that.
Agreed. Jayesh, anything before we move on?
Nothing from me, thank you.
So the next thing we wanted to consider was clearly the rollout of hydrogen through electrolyzers will place significant demand on the electricity supply and electricity network within Lithuania and also within any other country that really is serious about rolling out hydrogen. And what we wanted to do was to sort of say, okay, will there be enough renewable electricity to meet this hydrogen demand, both in the near term, that 2030 horizon, and also in the longer term when hydrogen becomes an appreciable share of final energy demand. And this is a debate that is forming policy, again, very much at an EU level. Many of you will have seen the proposed Hydrogen Delegated Act come through from the European Commission in the last few weeks. And that's a contentious act precisely because the EU wishes to impose certain restrictions to ensure that renewable electricity used for hydrogen is in some way partly funded or underpinned by those hydrogen projects, and to avoid a situation where hydrogen electrolyzers are drawing from a grid network at times when that network is under strain or that generation capacity is under strain to meet demand. And so we wanted to look at that in the Lithuanian context. And what we found essentially is good news. At least in the 2030 horizon, the current plans for renewable development in Lithuania, which envisions up to 7 gigawatts of renewables by 2030 through onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar. Those current plans are more than enough to cater for the electrolyzer hydrogen production demand that we're talking about in our central 2030 scenario. And as a result, the excess renewables, if you like, that over and above what will meet hydrogen demand will be used to displace fossil fuels, which is great. And that's true not just for our central case, but also for our high case. All right, so we see almost no risk of electrolyzers putting a strain on renewable electricity supply or taking up all that renewable electricity supply in 2030. By 2050, the situation changes a bit in that now hydrogen is a much bigger part of the economy. And also demand for electricity in other parts of the economy have increased through use of electric vehicles, potentially through use of heat pumps, and also through more general population and economic growth. So what this means is this isn't necessarily bad news. It just reinforces the role of long-term planning in the Lithuanian electricity system, whereby beyond 2030, as we move from 2030 to 2050, we will need to think about how we get more renewables into the Lithuanian energy mix beyond that 2030 plan. And there's a few different ways that this can happen. So collaboration with neighbouring Baltic states to co-develop or import more renewable electricity is certainly one option that multiple stakeholders have flagged to us. Developing renewables and hydrogen outside the electricity network, so co-location of potentially offshore or onshore wind with electrolyzers, such that they're not really connected to the network and not putting any real strain on the grid system, is also something that could be considered. And then finally, investment in the electricity network, whether it's reinforcing the existing internal transmission network or building additional interconnection capacity with other EU member states. These are all things that will help ensure that enough renewable electricity is in the system to keep it net zero by 2035 and beyond, but also meeting this additional demand that a hydrogen economy imposes in our scenarios. In the near term, exports of hydrogen will largely be limited to balancing volumes, right? So we're not predicting that hydrogen Lithuania will be a large net importer or net exporter of hydrogen in the near term. But rather there will be some import and export activity to help with periods of shortage or excess. In the longer term, the expansion of renewable development plants and the import of hydrogen or renewable power, as we said, through those investment in either interconnection capacity or otherwise will be required. So all in all, certainly no, I think, yellow or red flags to go with the interaction of hydrogen and renewables in Lithuanian electricity system. Now, what we don't show here in this slide, but what we do show in our full report, is that hydrogen should also have a positive impact on the economics of renewables in Lithuania. So all countries that start to have a very high share of renewable electricity in their power system start to undergo what's known as price cannibalization, where the large share of renewables on the system starts to reduce the price achieved by those renewables in the market. And hydrogen is a sort of a counterbalance to this, because it provides a ready buyer of renewable electricity at times where there might be excess renewable electricity that is depressing prices. And that's important because it essentially reduces the subsidy support required from the economy and from government for those renewable electricity assets by keeping the price they achieve in the market high. So that's all I wanted to say on the interaction between sort of renewable electricity and hydrogen. Before we move on to, I would say, a summary of putting Lithuania in context, Jayesh or Ervinas, was there anything you wanted to add on that?
Just one thing, there's a question in the chat, Shane, actually, which is relating to the use case of hydrogen in shipping. It's a two-part question. Have we carried out research regarding international shipping company plans? That's one. And those outside EU companies need to invest in new vessels. To what extent have those investments been included in the overall investment costs associated with that? So it's a two-part question.
Yeah, so to answer the first part of the question, as part of developing our view of shipping fuel demand for hydrogen in all of our scenarios, yes, we have looked at activity among different shipping companies. What we see is that activity at this stage is very much in pilots. Shipping companies are piloting different forms of technology. Sometimes it's green ammonia through hydrogen. Sometimes it's green methanol through hydrogen. But when it comes to taking a view on how much shipping demand there will be, we are probably more led by policy and regulation targets set by countries, by the EU, than we are by these initial pilots that shipping companies are doing. These pilots certainly reflect an expectation that that policy will move in the future, but cannot by themselves be sort of taken as a sole indicator of how that shipping demand will evolve. Shesh, you might need to remind me the second part of the question.
Part of the question was really related to the costs, and to what extent have we looked at the costs of new vessels in our transition process. And I was going to respond to say that in terms of general fleet renewal, etc., we haven't accounted for that as a specific additional cost. But you may well want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, so we have accounted for additional costs incurred as a result of fleet being more expensive than the incumbent fleet, right? So taking the hydrogen-powered heavy goods vehicle as an example, if you were to say that is 50% more expensive than a traditional diesel-powered heavy goods vehicle, then we account for the extra 50%, but we don't account for the full 150%, if that makes sense. Very good. So to round off this first phase of the presentation, here are 6 points which we think summarize the Lithuanian context and what makes it unique in terms of how we form a hydrogen strategy around it. The first one is this proven domestic demand in ammonia for fertilizers. And that's quite large in the context of Lithuania's overall sort of size and economic output. Fertilizers plays a larger role in Lithuania's heavy industry than it does in other EU member states. Heavy goods vehicles are also present in quite a large role, and this is as a result of quite an extensive, I would say, flow through of heavy goods vehicles moving from the Central European region to the Baltic region and vice versa. So I think over 80% of goods vehicles that travel through Lithuania and within Lithuania are in that very heavy category, traveling very long distance, that is more suitable to hydrogen and to battery electric vehicles. So that provides a solid basis of demand. So that's point number one. Point number two is electrolyzers will drive the energy security agenda and will enable ambitious renewables targets. So as we've said through this presentation so far, the Lithuanian plans to develop more renewable power to reduce reliance on natural gas and oil, and this being accentuated by the impact of Russia's invasion on the Ukraine, very much underpins the need to produce hydrogen from electrolyzers within Lithuania using Lithuanian electricity. The third point here is that more renewable power supply will need to be unlocked to serve hydrogen production, but only in the long term, less in the near term. So this is that point we made on the previous slide, that the supply of renewable electricity is more than adequate for 2030 demand in all our scenarios. But longer term, more onshore and offshore wind resource will need to be unlocked. The fourth point we want to make is that demand and feedstock supply are clustered in different regions within Lithuania, and that regional aspect may determine where Lithuania decides to put its own hydrogen values. So if we think about supply, we think about the sort of coastal region where both onshore and offshore wind within Lithuania will be clustered. But if we think about demand, particularly that fertilizer demand that's quite ready now, we think about more the sort of central region around Kaunas and Vilnius, where fertilizer production is currently centered. And we'll talk about this in 1 or 2 slides time, but that means we may have multiple hydrogen valleys. Next point is that well-connected networks can be leveraged, and storage options are more limited, but ammonia demand could be an enabler of that storage. So what we mean here is that the current state of the electricity network and gas network will help underpin initial development of hydrogen with some reinforcement, but broadly an assessment has been done of how the natural gas network could be retrofitted to provide a hydrogen network, and how much retrofitting versus new build will need to be done. You know, that's part of Amber Grid's participation in the EU hydrogen backbone, which is the sort of broader vision for how hydrogen pipeline transmission will emerge in Europe. With storage, hydrogen can either be stored in sort of pressurized containers, or in salt caverns, or what we call geological storage. And what we find is Lithuania doesn't have as much access, or at least not as much proven access, to that geological storage as other countries such as Germany and Denmark and the UK, which have that. But counter to that, what we find is that because fertilizers have such an outsized role in demand, the use of hydrogen to ammonia can itself be used as storage. So storing ammonia could be a way around the fact that there is less access to geological storage, and given that ammonia consumption to make fertilizer is somewhat flexible, it's quite seasonal. Then final point is there is active R&D currently in Lithuania with regards to some hydrogen enabling technologies, particularly the next generation of electrolyzer technology. But what we see is it's sort of disparate and isolated sometimes. There is not necessarily at the moment a big connection between R&D efforts and industry efforts, and there isn't a clear roadmap to bring that R&D expertise into industry. So anything to add to that, Jayesh or Irvinus, before we move on?
Not for me, thank you.
Let's move on.
So the next part of the presentation, we're going to focus on the vision and action plan. And again, if anyone has any burning questions around the scenarios or the Lithuanian context that we've just outlined, we're happy to take any questions in that regard now before we move on to this. So I'll just pause for a moment or two to see if any questions arise.
Norėčiau paraginti dalyvius, jeigu turite klausimų, dabar galėtumėte užduoti dėl pirmosios dalies prieš pereinant prie veiksmų plano. Taip, aš matau gerbiamo Juozo ranką. Prašom. There's a question from Juozas Tunaitis.
I'm technical director of stock company Achema in Lithuania. We're producing nitric fertilizers. So you mentioned here hydrogen for fertilizer. We consume a lot of hydrogen. So the sustainability of all these studies for me seems when the price of the European emission allowances is high enough. So you didn't mention about the price of allowances. How do you think, is it not important here when speaking about our hydrogen strategy, or you rely that all the actions from the European politicians will be done to keep the high price of allowances? Thank you.
A great question. Thank you for that, Juozas. And I think it's sort of preempting the next bit of the presentation where we talk about how rather than what. And certainly I think when it comes to the fertilizer industry and the refinery industry, you're absolutely right that the price of carbon allowances is what drives change. And there are two challenges there. One is predicting that price, and the other is dealing with the volatility in that price. And certainly there are as you mentioned, there's a certain risk around how much politicians will act to ensure that price rises and drives that change. And then B, there's also the question of, well, are there mechanisms you can use to stabilize that price? And we're watching very closely to sort of see if Germany follows through on its plans to provide carbon contracts for difference, which would effectively stabilize the carbon price in those industries, in the same way that the auctions and contract for difference in the electricity industry have worked very well to deploy wind and solar over the last 10 years.
The second part of the question, I think, Shane, was also around looking at the way that there's sufficiency of renewable hydrogen, which comes in at a relatively low marginal cost, because the immediate consumption and the consumption of electricity and the replacement of that with renewable electricity has been taken on. So what we're doing is basically using electricity at relatively low marginal cost associated with the production of hydrogen. So it's that combination that we're reliant on. Unless there are any further questions, what I suggest we do is to start talking about the vision and action plan. And in this next section, what I'll talk about is the long-term vision for hydrogen in Lithuania. We'll then narrow down, we'll bring the sort of telescope in, and we'll zoom in on 2030 goals, and then the action plans, medium term, and then very short term, in order to be able to deliver those 2030 goals, but also then put us on the path to delivering this long-term vision. So that's the order in which we will discuss this next section. So if we step back and look forward through to the 2040s and 2050s, what is the vision for hydrogen in Lithuania? The first and foremost, as I've talked about twice already, is really looking at energy independence. And that is really driven by the investment in and availability of renewable electricity from particularly the offshore sector in Lithuania. So that will drive energy independence. But what we need to do is to use that renewable electricity and generate hydrogen from that in order to be able to drive that hydrogen to the hard to electrolyze sectors. So what we will be doing is prioritizing hydrogen from domestic renewables rather than converting this into an industry that imports renewables from further afield. And we're doing that for two reasons. One, which is the availability of renewable electricity and the projected availability of that. But the second thing is really also looking at the sort of cost trade-off of domestic renewables converted to hydrogen versus hydrogen traveling greater distances associated with that. As we've talked about already, what we're looking at is use cases that are anchored around, low carbon ammonia, subsequent use of that, and heavy duty vehicles as the sources of demand. Those are the primary use cases. We've got refineries as another significant use case, albeit that is a point load and a more immediate opportunity associated with that. Any deployment outside of that or further afield in terms of things like aviation or marine fuel is also taken account of, but that is likely to come place slower and over the longer term. And then in parallel with that, what we're expected to factor in is a Baltic hydrogen highway and a connection in potentially with the European hydrogen backbone, both for sort of transport, import, export by about 2040. And that will line up with the EU plans for the EU hydrogen backbone. And then the last part of this long-term vision for hydrogen is really looking at the value chain in terms of development of that, and look at how we might be able to create sustainable construction, asset management, asset maintenance, employment that will service the economy in the fullest sense associated with that. So there is already R&D capability in several hydrogen enabling technologies locally. There is international, development and investment in the electrolyzer technology, etc. But the massive jobs and the massive growth in those jobs are likely to be in the construction, the development of the networks, and then the subsequent maintenance of those assets associated with that. So that's an overview of our long-term vision for hydrogen in Lithuania. Let's now move on to progressively narrowing down, first of all, through what's sort of network infrastructure, then looking at goals and specific action plans. Shane.
Thanks, Jayesh. And I guess why is this important? So the enabling of a reasonably low cost hydrogen, or certainly avoiding very high cost hydrogen, hinges on being able to move it around from areas of cheaper production to areas of consumption, not just within Lithuania, but as Jayesh mentioned, through enabling connection with other countries through the Baltic region of the so-called hydrogen backbone. We've mentioned this backbone a few times already in this presentation, but for anyone who's not aware, it's essentially a vision and analysis of hydrogen transmission pipelines across Europe from a 2030 horizon, a 2040 horizon, and a 2050 horizon, and it's the combined effort of over 20 of Europe's gas network operators, including Ambergrid in this call. And what you see here on the left-hand side is essentially Ambergrid's contribution to that. So where how hydrogen can be transmitted through Lithuania, and crucially, what part of that network can be retrofitted from the existing natural gas transmission pipeline network, and where new pipelines might need to be built to service the hydrogen economy. It's difficult to speculate whether this vision will arise on time, early or later, given that it obviously depends on how quickly hydrogen demand will emerge, and also how quickly the sort of mechanisms for funding these very large capital infrastructure will emerge. But what essentially we want to show here is that, as we said on a couple of slides previously, that production is very much likely to be centered in the long term around region with strong wind output near Klaipėda, and very much in the northwest of the country, and that will need to move hydrogen down to the sort of central southeast of the country, where fertilizer production is currently centered. On top of that, you have oil refining activity in the north, and as we assume that continues to play a role in the long term for Lithuania, there will also be a need to connect that to any hydrogen network. What we've also shown here is that the road network becomes important, and that becomes an important driver in the near term of driving the adoption of hydrogen in heavy goods vehicles. So the EU has set a minimum criteria of at least one hydrogen refueling station every 150 kilometers of road to enable that long distance hydrogen heavy goods vehicles use case to emerge. What that means for Lithuania is I think we need at a minimum 5 stations by 2030 in order to meet that criteria. So there are multiple ways that this could result in different valleys. One option is to put a valley in Klaipėda and a valley in the central region and a valley in the northern region. But ultimately, any of these could be combined together. There is limited sort of restrictions on how you define these valleys. And it could be that the Klaipėda Valley grows in to become that northern valley separate to the southeastern one. So that's just some important elements of the network infrastructure we wanted to flag when talking about the vision. Then, as Jayesh mentioned, we want to put some hard numbers that everyone can organize themselves around and try to deliver. And for 2030, aligning with our central scenario, we're targeting 300 to 350 megawatts of electrolyzer production capacity. And that's to enable around 30 kilotons of low carbon hydrogen production, representing approximately 1% of overall target EU capacity and about 0.3% of production, respectively. Now, as Erwin has mentioned earlier, we don't want to prescribe that being electrolyzer production. If it makes sense to do so, some part of it could be through blue hydrogen, but certainly in terms of hydrogen output, in terms of tons produced, those are the numbers we're aiming for. And what that will mean is that 15% of domestic ammonia production is enabled by low carbon hydrogen. It'll mean hydrogen buses are in place where they are preferred to other zero emission solutions in Lithuania's 5 major cities. There's an option there to have a pilot hydrogen train, particularly along freight routes where the electrification of the route is less economical. And we also predict 1% of heavy goods vehicles fuel demand is served by hydrogen in 2030. So very concrete, very reasonably ambitious, but also achievable targets for capacity and demand. We're also setting a target of approximately 2% of demand is in seasonal storage by 2030. So having a long-term storage for that hydrogen, whether it's through storage as ammonia or through some form of geological storage that we need to find. Ultimately, what we want to say is that hydrogen is being used within the broader energy system as a long-term storage fuel carrier. We're also targeting 50 to 100 heavy goods vehicles powered by hydrogen in the mid-2020s to sort of underpin that minimum investment in the refueling network of 5 refueling stations that we talked about. And as with other countries, we want to test hydrogen blending into the gas transmission network to ensure that we upskill ourselves in switching from gas transmission to hydrogen transmission in the long term. We also want to establish the first hydrogen valley centered around fertilizer production with the aim to serve 2030 targets and including involvement from R&D and academic institutes in Kaunas and Vilnius and really starting to tie together expertise within academia with concrete objectives of industry. We also want to establish 1 to 2 other hydrogen valleys, strategically placed, most likely around Klaipėda, and these will help optimize the sort of location of future supply and demand. So when we think about there will come a point where there is enough hydrogen demand to really justify that transition to pipelines away from smaller scale co-location of electrolyzers and establishing those valleys early will help underpin that. Then all of this, if achieved, we think will lead to sustainable jobs in construction and asset maintenance created by 2030. We've estimated this in our financial analysis that Erwin has talked about earlier, and we think that there are over 1,000 up to 1,200 sustainable jobs in construction and asset maintenance that will be created by 2030. Sustainable in the sense that they do not involve one-off projects. They involve continued need for those skills in the continued growth of the hydrogen economy out to 2050. We've also established a number of softer targets, memorandums of understanding with member EU states on areas of collaboration. So particularly in developing more renewables around Baltic states, but also exploring import and export opportunities, balancing opportunities with other neighboring countries, and leveraging the resources of other neighboring countries, potentially with respect to storage, and leveraging our own strengths, with respect to demand and also to skills. We want to invest in human capital. We want this whole exercise has been very much underpinned by engaging with stakeholders in the Lithuanian economy to sort of gauge the current state of investment in training and skills required to deliver this, and certainly one need we identified was degree courses targeting particular what we'd call sort of labor skills, hard hat skills versus more professional engineering and science, white collar roles required to deliver this change to gas systems and deliver these renewable technologies. And we want potentially also incentives in place for keeping, attracting, and retaining talent to ensure we get the right people delivering this. Finally, then the question of capturing the value chain. So, this is where can we move beyond simply creating jobs in construction and asset maintenance and into manufacturing components of the value chain. And in this respect, we set a target of linking R&D activity to industry more and fostering development, particularly through the Klaipėda economic zone, fostering development of small and medium-sized companies that can help provide some parts of the infrastructure required. So those are the goals that underpinned the vision. What we will do now then is talk about a 14-point action plan to start delivering those goals, and how we've sort of constructed this action plan is to think, what do we need to do to generate some momentum initially to start delivering things by the mid-2020s? What are almost the small wins we can generate that help us build expertise and help build a sense of understanding within the broader population that hydrogen has a significant role to play in Lithuania. We then, on top of that, we want to think about, okay, what activities do we need to start doing now that help us meet our 2030 targets? What do we need to do to start to really deliver large-scale infrastructure that helps meet or underpin that sort of central scenario of producing, I think, 26 or 30,000 tons of hydrogen by 2030. And then finally, beyond 2030, there are steps we need to take this decade to start planning for beyond this decade. And that then sort of revolves around back to Rosa's point earlier around how do you set up a business model or a market model for industries and private companies to take decarbonisation into their own hands and to be confident that they can invest in low carbon solutions while still being competitive. And it also means considering options and taking decisions around how the network evolves, both the gas network and the electricity network. And that planning and that analysis does start this decade. So if we start with the sort of actions that help us generate momentum early, I think the first one is really around taking ownership of the strategy and establishing governance. And I think we already see that to some extent with the establishment of a hydrogen industry body group within Lithuania. That's been an important part of this project. and through the continued interest of everyone in this call. But what will happen now is that the Ministry of Energy will take ownership of the strategy. I'm sure will refine the strategy and improve it, and set a course for how it is delivered, updated, and delegated down for individual organizations to deliver. We then want to develop pilot use cases in heavy goods vehicles. And again, this will underpin the rollout of some minimum level of hydrogen refueling infrastructure on roads to meet that minimum EU target for refueling network on what's called the 10D. This is the established freight route network of roads around Europe. And developing those pilot use cases, whether it's small fleets from logistics providers or small fleets from private companies who use their own logistics, that will really help underpin that infrastructure. We then want, as mentioned earlier, to roll out hydrogen buses across the 5 largest cities. Doesn't necessarily mean those cities will be 100% hydrogen buses, but we do want to see hydrogen buses in them. Again, this will underpin refueling infrastructure. It will underpin the investment case for further use of hydrogen within those cities, and it will underpin investment in electrolyzer production. So we want to see that happen to meet mid-2020 targets. We then want to enable projects through the establishment of health and safety regulation and environmental planning. We haven't talked about this much so far in this presentation, but we have done a high-level sort of screening of what health and safety actions or policies need to be in place for all this. So thinking about having clear policy around health and safety with deployment of electrolyzers, having clear policy with respect to how hydrogen is stored, how hydrogen is transmitted, clear policy around health and safety with respect to hydrogen vehicles, with respect to hydrogen refueling infrastructure. These all need to be in place again, so that industry can invest with confidence in these use cases. Then in terms of meeting 2030 targets, first we want to deliver scaled up project delivery in fertilizers and establish the first hydrogen valley around fertilizer production. Again, I think Irvin has mentioned here that EU funding through the joint the just transition mechanism will be crucial in delivering that. And that really will underpin meeting a lot of the targets and establishing a lot of the 300 to 350 megawatts of electrolyzer capacity. Then we want to begin testing hydrogen blending in the gas network. Again, underpinning the sort of technical challenges and health and safety concerns more so than actually delivering part of the overall target hydrogen demand, but really enabling the transition of the network to hydrogen long term. Then number 8 here, which is slightly ambiguously worded, is prepare for market-based scale-up. And what we really mean here is decide what are the mechanisms, what are the market mechanisms we're going to use to essentially to underpin investment in hydrogen. Right, and there are a few options here, and these options are considered in more detail in the sort of main report. But options to be considered are things like carbon contracts for difference to stabilize the price of carbon. It could be hydrogen contracts for difference, or hydrogen sort of subsidies to sort of link the price of hydrogen to the price of fuel being displaced. And it could equally be changes to how the underlying electricity feeding into producing hydrogen is allocated and funded. And what those mean is that you move from a world where you're assigning CapEx or assigning capital to fund pilot projects on a kind of more case-by-case project basis, to a more market-based world where projects are competing and costs are coming down for those projects. Then number 9 here is investing in seasonal storage for hydrogen. So as we mentioned on the previous slide, we want to achieve a sort of a 2% target of seasonal storage. And the reason here is that there will be inherent intermittency in how hydrogen is produced. So the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time, but demand for hydrogen will peak in winter periods versus summer periods. For that reason, meeting these targets, it is essential to have quite a substantial amount of the hydrogen produced available for storage. And to use the gas as an analog, I think globally, something like 10 to 12% of natural gas consumed it has storage capacity available. So we want to start to achieve the same, a similar scale of hydrogen storage by 2030, acknowledging that it will need to grow again much more, probably to something like 10 to 15% by 2050. Then point number 10 is building capability and human capital in hydrogen. And again, this is around, as we mentioned previously, targeting degree courses and trainings that enable people to acquire jobs in this sector with the requisite skills, and acknowledging that, okay, those jobs might not exist today, but they certainly will exist in 4 to 5 years' time when those degrees courses end. And then 11, we've established that aviation and shipping are some of these cases that will be very long term, that will be very much post 2030. But we can start to assess whether it makes sense to participate in pilots, either independently or through participation with other member states, in order to gain learnings and to gain more understanding of exactly the role that hydrogen play in Lithuania with respect to those. And we see these pilots to some extent kicking off in other member states as well, despite the fact that it's very early for scale up. Then the final 3 points of our 14-point action plan. First is establishing a business model for low carbon flexibility in the power system. So in point number 8, we talked about market-based mechanisms. This is a closely related point here in that the role of hydrogen in the power system, through both electrolyzers and through using hydrogen to power, very much depends on how the broader electricity market is designed. And we see in some countries that we use things like capacity markets to underpin flexible power, and we also see quite a lot of disruption in various power systems in how flexible power is funded. So we see coal to power very much on the way out. We see gas to power growing in some countries and declining in other countries. And designing a mechanism that manages this transition stably and securely, and does not pick technology winners, will be key in underpinning how hydrogen rolls out in Lithuania in the long term. And then the final 2 points are just long-term planning for the role of hydrogen in both fuel mix and in transmission and storage. So it's going into more detail than we've been able to go to here around exactly when and at what point does it make sense, for instance, to transition from natural gas to hydrogen pipelines, or to transition from relying on the electricity network to power electrolyzers versus relying on the gas network to power to move that hydrogen around. So as we mentioned, we expect initially hydrogen production in the next few years in the first wave of projects to be set close to demand. But at some point that production will need to move closer to that Klaipėda region where the resource is available. And what we're saying here is that, you know, we have not had the remit or scope in this project to really economically analyze when is the most sensible point to do that. But that is an important question that should be followed on through further long-term planning. I've talked for quite a bit there over those few slides. Maybe Jayesh or Ervinas, is there anything you sort of want to add around that action plan and sort of zoom in vision that we've just gone through?
Just a couple of things. The first thing is that in the conversations we've had with the Energy Ministry as we've produced and discussed this, there's an acknowledgement across all sides that this has to be part of an integrated energy policy development. So whilst we're focusing on hydrogen, there are other developments associated with that, and clearly that policy development will then follow through with regulation, incentive arrangements, etc. So we see that as part of an integrated package. What we've got here is a top-level action point set of recommendations, focusing in on hydrogen, but this will be part of the longer-term energy strategy as well.
Yeah, I think our time dedicated to presentation is running out. So I guess it would be sensible to take questions or comments from the audience. And then I think the ministry also wants to take like 5 to 10 minutes for the next steps. So if you have any more questions or comments, I guess please raise your hand and we'll take them. Galite ir lietuviškai.
Taip, siūlytume pasinaudoti galimybę tikrai užduoti tikslinančius klausimus ir aš matau jau kylančias rankas. Taip, gerbiamas Laimonas Rimkus, prašau.
Labą dieną, hello, good day. Dear gentlemen, very interesting information. Myself, I represent the stevedoring company Beka. We are located in Klaipėda port, and I'm general manager. And I have a question for Shane, correct name, yeah? What is a requirement for the land plot in regards of sanitary zones for production plant of low carbon hydrogen? Do you have a practice on that?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Actually, Shane, you're on mute still as well.
Okay, so maybe somebody else can answer this question, because I read in your presentation that several places can be chosen for that purpose, and actually Klaipėda is a good location because of communication, pipeline, electricity, and Western Lithuania, as you know, is full of the renewable energy sources that are running already and that are foreseen to be built recently in a few years. So also the port activities, the transport corridors, so it's a good site. So what is your recommendation for to construct such plant? What is distances from the citizens, from let's say neighborhood? What risks are, and are there any papers where we could read that? Thank you.
If I could look at that, answer that first. When we've generally looked at these facilities, we've generally taken account of the location of major industrial hazards and confirmed very broadly the suitability. We've not looked at specific containment measures, nor have we looked at specific distances from centers of population or anything like that from a safety or a location of industrial hazards perspective. There are a number of papers that have already been written where we're talking about things like ammonia, particularly, where there are established. In the field of hydrogen, this is still developing, and indeed regulations for the safe containment of hydrogen. Now, the challenge or the benefit of hydrogen is that whilst hydrogen is more explosive, in many respects, it is actually, you know, a cleaner a commodity to store and does not carry the sort of poisonous effects associated with that. Hydrogen also disperses more easily depending on the nature of the sort of containment associated with that. So this is something that's still developing. We haven't taken account of that in very specific terms in the study. What we've done is said broad brush, you know, these port facilities should be suitable, or these valleys should be suitable associated with that. Thank you for explaining your question. I hope that answers it as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
There are two questions in the chat, Shane. One from Arturus, which is what is meant by net zero power as in action 12? That's a specific question associated with that. And then there's a question on the quantity of hydrogen to be stored as seasonal storage.
Yeah, thanks for that, Jayesh. I think on the question around net zero power, there are a couple of ways you could define that. One, in the most strict sense of the word, I think what we mean is that Lithuania is able to produce 100% low carbon or essentially zero carbon power by 2035 to meet its needs. And that's the very sort of extreme strict definition of it. Another more flexible definition of it is that you on a net basis, your power system or your electricity system is 100% low carbon, but actually that requires considerable import and export of renewable electricity. So there will be times where Lithuania has excess renewable electricity, it can export to other countries, and there'll be times when there is a shortfall in Lithuania and it can import from other countries, and so we mean essentially somewhere along that spectrum. In terms of the role of hydrogen to power and kind of how strict we've been, we've taken the sort of we've taken existing studies of how the power system is intended to evolve in Lithuania. We've looked at those studies, which are not net zero by 2035. They take a sort of longer term view, and we said, okay, there is this much natural gas to power in that capacity mix. So if we're going to achieve net zero power by 2035, then we need to replace that, and we replace that either through hydrogen to power or through biogas or biomethane to power. And so we've taken a view on the role of each in delivering that. Does that answer the question? Please follow up if not, and I'll try to clarify.
Yes. So Arturas may clarify if he wants to. So then there is another question from Mr. Šarūnas Purvinas about the quantity of hydrogen we consider under point 9 as seasonal storage. Do you have in mind direct hydrogen storage or some derivatives of it? And yeah, the short question is, yeah, both direct and derivatives. But yeah, Shane, if you want to, you can expand.
Yeah. So the quantity we considered, I think, is 2%, and I think we stated that on the previous slide around targets, and that is a sort of a stepping stone to a higher quantity of around 10%, we would say, of hydrogen demand, and the reason or the logic behind that is that, again, if you're producing hydrogen from let's say offshore or onshore wind, In what we call a typical weather year, acknowledging there probably is no such thing as a typical weather year, but we try to find a fairly representative kind of historical year for how much wind blew. And then we look at, okay, if you had to turn that intermittent wind output and produce hydrogen from it, how much storage would you need to make sure that you had a ready access to hydrogen, what we call a firm hydrogen supply in the system? And we sort of using that approach, and also looking at how much the natural gas system needs, you quickly kind of arrive at that around 10% of demand range in terms of how much storage you need. Now that's in the long term. As we look at 2030, and we're still very much dealing with, I would say, point-to-point hydrogen projects rather than a fully integrated system. We thought the storage requirements will be more short-term, because people will be more often than not blending sort of hydrogen as part of a broader fuel mix rather than switching to pure hydrogen. And then the second part of your question, Sarnas, we are considering multiple options. We mentioned frequently through the presentation that we're considering ammonia as a storage option, and the idea being there that is somewhat integrated already into fertilizer production, and that fertilizer production is quite seasonal. So there is an option there, and you know, we've identified it without exploring it in too much detail, but there is an option there to potentially turn hydrogen into ammonia and store it as ammonia when you have excess hydrogen production, and that then can be used at a later point in the year for fertilizer production. And what that allows you to do then is ensure that you sort of hydrogen which you need for instance for transport, which is much less seasonal and less flexible and requires a much more stable output, that can be almost prioritized when hydrogen output from the electrolyzers is low. What we've recommended in one of the sub-actions also is worth flagging is that Lithuania should investigate geological storage. There's no ready geological storage, but there is a geological survey or body responsible for surveying that can take this as an action from this plan to investigate forms of storage other than that ammonia option.
I see hand of Juozas again.
Speaking about the targets for 2030, heavy industry has the requirement to have a stable supply of power. You spoke a little bit about the stability of the grids, but in which topic you consider that we will be provided with the continuous power when the green power generation could be very flexible, could be volatile, but we need continuous supply. Where do you consider this topic? Thank you.
So I'll maybe answer that first, and then open to Jayesh or Irvinus. This is clearly a question that is being considered at across all EU member states that are now planning to have a very high share of renewables in their system, and what we've tried to do in our 14-point plan is flag that in point number 12, where we need a business model for low carbon flexible power. And this is in the form of hydrogen to power, it's in the form of biomethane to power, it's in the form of batteries, it's in the form of pumped storage, and for you know the next few years certainly it's also in the form of natural gas to power. These will very much underpin the stable, secure supply of power in times where there is less wind and less solar output. On top of this, you have planned interconnection capacity from Litgrid to other neighbouring countries. Clearly, that is driven by a need to switch away from the Russian electricity network system to the European one. But in the future, it will also underpin security of electricity supply. So we don't see any security of electricity supply issues, or certainly none have been raised to us through this development of the hydrogen strategy.
If I could just add to that, I think it's a good question really around the dynamics of this, and we haven't modeled a dynamic energy system with all of the vectors, interacting on a real-time basis or near real-time basis into the long term. The way we've dealt with that is really around sufficiency of the base capacity, storage, and consideration that each of these vectors play a part in delivering a stable hydrogen system, but also a stable electricity system. And the consideration of the role of each vector in doing that. Broad brush, what we've done is done this on the basis of the volume of electricity that's available, renewable electricity that's available, that turns into hydrogen. Broad brush, it's converted into a storage level, and broad brush, it's consideration of the fact that some of that hydrogen may need to be reconverted back to power to support the power system. But it's a good question, that what we will need to do is to deliver that energy system stability. That's both sufficiency to deliver security of supply of hydrogen, but also sufficiency in terms of that electricity system to make sure that that is balanced. One last point I wanted to make is that, and clearly we're dealing with a relatively small region here in terms of the sort of Baltic nations, but the expansion beyond Lithuania also provides some diversity, and particularly connection into the European grid for hydrogen, for electricity, will actually provide that diversity of supply and demand, which allows some of that stability to be delivered through that diversity on the interconnected countries in the grid. I hope we've addressed that question.
So thank you. I cannot see any hands raised so far, and I assume that amount of the information was such a huge, and of course we can consider that it was not almost, it's more than a year of the work, so and research, so it can be difficult to digest all the things, but maybe last question, do you see any Lithuanian advantages? Let's say, do you believe that it is doable to create in a short terms hydrogen economy in Lithuania, given the framework that we have a gas grid, electricity grid, capability of electricity, renewables, and so on. How do you see the Lithuanian advantages? And then I have one question from Pius, but maybe you could address it.
And I was speaking at a conference in Vilnius actually about 2 weeks ago, where this exact question was asked. What's the sort of what are the strengths of Lithuania in respect to the development of the hydrogen economy? And a really significant one is the availability of natural resources, if you like, and particularly the forthcoming harvesting of wind energy to generate renewable electricity. That is a huge advantage. And that proximity to that resource and the ability to be able to connect that through to reasonably proximate, meaning close by in both distance terms, but also in terms of conversion terms, use cases provides for a very strong set of advantages associated with that. Now, one corresponding disadvantage, if you like, is that the territory of Lithuania, but also the adjacent Baltic countries, are relatively sparsely populated. So your demand loads, where they do exist, whilst they're proximate, they're not massive in terms of size. So in terms of the scale efficiency associated with that, what you've got is then an advantage initially that you can actually get going faster because your costs of conversion, etc., are lower. But at the same time, what you've got to do is to deal with a comparative, potentially in the long term, future scale inefficiency where you've got more infrastructure usage to support the load for the geography and the density of that load coming through. Hopefully, I've answered that from a SWOT perspective. And then, was it Pius?
Pius, just
hello. Pius from Makema Group. So I listened to your presentation and deeply involved in the topic myself, and I understand the complexity of it. And as Shilvan has mentioned, over a year of research. So my question is, so we have this plan right now. We have 12 points. We have assumed responsible bodies who should take over or proposed to take over. So from your experience, how we should move to actions right now? Because so we have this document, what we should do to make it happen, because 2030 actually it is tomorrow, or some people would say it is yesterday. So yeah, what is your experience? How other maybe countries, how they acted, let's say, after these kind of documents released, and to make it something real? Yeah, that is my question.
So I'll make a quick point on how the study deals with this, and I think Jayesh will talk more about his broader experience from history. We do have a sort of a more detailed version of the action plan that breaks down the 14 points into individual tasks, which we haven't had time to go through today, but it is there. And we also have what we call a sort of next 6 to 12 months to get things moving part of the action plan, which again we've ran out of time to do today, but it is there, and I think should start to address or sort of make some of these next steps more concrete. Jayesh?
Thank you, Shane. And I think one of the conversations that we've had through the process with 2 presentations to the Ministry of Energy is that the Ministry of Energy realizes its central role in terms of taking things forward. So clearly the role of government in terms of establishing a clear, common, consistent, framework of that policy and taking that as an integrated energy system is going to be quite key. So, Shane's talked about a number of the specific actions. One of those actions is around, the generation of a task force that will actually drive through, specific detailed decisions associated with that. Now, related to that are going to be some technical questions, there are going to be some financial questions, and there are going to be some operational and practical questions. But that policy development needs to take place, first of all, in a coherent, consistent fashion. I've said that then needs to be translated into a framework to start undertaking anticipatory investment, so that companies like Amber Grid are provided with clear direction as to, their role in terms of this developing in a hydrogen economy. How much of that would be anticipatory investment? How would that be covered? What's the regulatory treatment of that? So as to start planting the seeds associated with supporting the development of the industry. That typically is the sort of, in terms of when we've looked at country plans that are beginning to take shape and take fruition in the most concrete way, that is the direct way that happens, that government takes the lead in resolving some of the uncertainty, providing some direction, and sets out the stepping stones associated with them.
Yeah, assume that it was a final remarks, and we don't have any raised hands, and maybe trying to finalize and to wrap up our meeting. I'd like to thank first, of course, for your presentation, and having in mind that hydrogen is, the future source of power and carriage of power. It might count until 12% or 25% of energy in the world, so in 2050. So we talk about very, very serious issues, and of course I'd like to thank you for this great job that you've done over this year, and like to thank you, Jay, Shane, Ervinas, and company of Baringa, Civita, and of course the EPSO-G group personally, and Amber Grid, those who were involved in this action, and so I assume that after this presentation, the study will be available for the public afterwards, and so the short information from our side, and maybe in Lithuanian for all the participants. Noriu padėkoti visiems, kurie prisijungė, ir ypatingai Vandenilio platformos dalyviams, todėl kad tai buvo vienas iš pagrindinių Vandenilio platformos uždavinių, ją sukuriant, tai yra parengti pagrindą gairiams, ir šiuo metu mes kaip ministerija organizuosime gairių ir veiksmų plano parengimą kaip teisinio dokumento, kuriam, kaip ir buvo minėta, turėtų pritarti vyriausybė. Tai bus sudaryta darbo grupė netrukus, ir per vasarą iki rudens turėtume turėti pirminį projektą, kuriam tikimės vyriausybė pritars, ir šios studijos pagrindu, šios studijos įžvalgų pagrindu, skaičiavimo, modeliavimo pagrindu parengsime vandenilio technologijų plėtros Lietuvoje gaires bei konkretų veiksmų planą, kuris bus papildytas dar be to, kas jau buvo pateikta. Taip kad tai bus kaip teisinio dokumento rengimo procesas, su juo bus supažindinta visuomenė ir suinteresuotos institucijos. Kaip matote, vandenilio panaudojimas yra labai platus tiek pramonėje, tiek transporte, tiek energetikoje. Taigi tikrai įtrauksime visus suinteresuotus asmenis ir konsultuosime su socialiniais ekonominiais partneriais, kuriems ir jau dabar dėkojame. Truputėlį užtrukome laiko. Ačiū visiems už dalyvavimą. Thank you very much for your presence and for information. I appreciate working with you and for all this time, and I do hope that we'll be continuing our connections, and we'll see maybe in Vilnius for the presentation of a hydrogen strategy, which is planned for the fall of this year. I assume that will be late autumn, presumably November, to present the final version as a legal document. So I do hope that we will see you in Vilnius maybe, and so for the rest, for the participants in platform, they will be involved in all the issues, and I'm really thankful for their own outputs and proposals during this work. So for today, I see Aiste, she's asking for the floor, but...
Yes, I would thank you a lot of... O gal lietuviškai, aš tiesiog, nes dabar truputį kreipiuosi jūs, Žilvinai. Buvo labai įdomu, esu iš Klaipėdos uosto, aplinkos apsaugos koordinatorė, ir dabar labai intensyviai bendraujam su ESPO organizacija, ir yra galimybė įtraukti Klaipėdos uostą kaip case study, būtent to vandenilio, žodžiu, plėtros uostuose ir pakrantėse tyrime. Tai vat šiandien irgi, aišku, pamatėm, kad kaip ir uostas, tarkim, turės vis svarbesnį vaidmenį vandenilio tiekime laivams. Aišku, dar klausimas yra dėl transporto ir aplamai dėl to vandenilio kaip tokio uosto vaidmens vandenilio saugojime, transportavime ar gamyboje, bet dar visi tie klausimai tokie yra neaiškus ir netgi taip sunku ir paklausti, nes čia tiesiog irgi, aišku, tai yra tolima ateitis, dar 30 metai, bet mes jau dabar vyksta tas komunikavimas, bendravimas dėl to dekarbonizavimo ir sakau dabar, bet rašom tą tokį planą, konsultuojame su ekspertais, iš kurios pusės, Klaipėdos uostui ar Klaipėdos tam regionui būtų, kaip sakant, tikslinga paanalizuoti ir tuo labiau, kad tarptautiniai ekspertai šiek tiek labiau atkreipti dėmesį Klaipėdos uostą kaip vieną iš uostų Baltijos regione ar Šiaurės regione. Tai aš tiesiog irgi norėjau pasiteirauti, ar galima bus su jumis dar, jeigu ką ateityje iškilus klausimams pasikonsultuoti, nes aš galvoju, čia mum ir tarpusavį dar yra klausimų nemažai, kur čia Klaipėda.
Be abejo, tikrai ir galėsim tai padaryti, kai bendrausime su Klaipėdos miestas, kaip jūs matėte, yra vienas iš kertinių, kuriant vandenilio slėnius, tai atvyksim į Klaipėdą, tikrai galėsim galbūt ir net ir pabendrauti tiesiogiai. Taip kad galbūt tai palikim mūsų šalim susitikimui ir tada nesinori daugiau trukdyti. Ačiū Jums labai, Aiste, už ir klausimą ir kad domitės ir aš tikrai visada pasirengę būsim bendradarbiauti su Jumis ir susitikti ir konsultuotis, jeigu reikės. Well, it was the final question. It may be mostly on bilateral issues and cooperation in the future. So, but nevertheless, I'd like to thank again for you for your time and for your work you have done. And I do hope that we'll keep in touch. And so. With the final words, there will be, I think, with the Amber Grid, and then afterwards we will finalize the contract and publish the study. And we, without any delay, would like to jump over the next steps and creating the legal action. So that's burden on our shoulders and responsibility of Ministry of Energy, but involving all the Ministry of Communication Economy as well. So I see that the work, the huge work in the future. So there will be quite a huge responsibility on us. So thank you very much again, and I'd like to propose to adjourn the meeting, and then we'll.
Sylvanus, if I could just say 2 sentences on behalf of Baringa and Civita, thank you very much for engaging us on this. We've really appreciated the dedication that everyone's shown in terms of supporting us on this project. We're delighted to have played our part in undertaking the analysis and showing the way forward. And just as we did with the integration of the gas economies, the natural gas economies, to create a single market, we're really very, very keen to see this roadmap turned into fruition. And we look forward to seeing you in autumn of this year.
Oh. Thank you. And I do hope that we'll see each other.
Thank you very much.
So that's it. Thank you very much, and see you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Cheers.